Samurai were carrying swords and fighting duels past the age of 60, not ceremonially, not symbolically, actually fighting. And the shoulder joint, the most structurally vulnerable joint in the upper body, held up across 50 years of daily sword work in ways that modern men training 3 days a week cannot replicate by 45. That is not a coincidence. It is not genetics. It is not that warriors were built from different materials. It is because they practiced one thing that modern fitness replaced with something that looks stronger, but quietly destroys the joint it claims to build. The bench press. And in a few minutes, you will understand exactly why that replacement, made in good faith, adopted across an entire training culture, has been accumulating damage in your shoulder since the first time you lay down on a flat bench and pressed a loaded bar toward the ceiling. To understand what samurai shoulders were built on, you have to understand what samurai shoulders were built for. A katana weighs between 900 grams and 1.2 kilograms. That is not a heavy object. But the samurai did not build their shoulder training around moving weight. They built it around controlling force, absorbing, redirecting, and generating rotational power through a joint that had to remain stable and pain-free for decades of daily practice. The core of that training was not what most people picture when they think of a warrior preparing for combat. It was not explosive. It was not heavy. It was slow, deliberate, and deeply loaded in one specific mechanical position that the modern gym has no direct equivalent for. It was called suburi, solo sword repetition, and in its full form, it was practiced for hundreds of repetitions every morning, often before sunrise, in the period running from Japan's Edo period through the late Meiji era, spanning roughly 1603 to the early 1900s. In the major ryu, the formal sword schools of feudal Japan, suburi was not supplementary practice. It was the foundation. Everything else built on it. Here is what it demanded from the shoulder. The sword is raised overhead, both arms extended, the joint loaded at full elevation. Then it is pulled down and forward in a controlled arc, decelerating against gravity rather than pressing against it. The posterior capsule of the shoulder, the back wall of the joint, is under sustained isometric tension throughout the movement. The rotator cuff musculature, specifically the infraspinatus and teres minor, is not just active, it is the engine. A senior practitioner at a traditional quote-unquote kenjutsu school in the Edo period might perform 1,000 suburi in a single morning session, not as a conditioning challenge, as normal practice. Their shoulders did not degrade, the joint was held. And when you understand what was happening at the cellular and mechanical level during those 1,000 repetitions, the reason becomes impossible to ignore. Pulling under load through a full overhead arc builds the posterior shoulder. Pressing under load through a horizontal arc compresses it. That is the entire argument. Everything else is detailed. The shoulder joint is not like the knee or the hip. It is a ball and socket that sacrifices structural stability for range of motion. The socket, the glenoid, is shallow. It holds the head of the humerus in place not through bone architecture, but through soft tissue, the labrum, the joint capsule, and four muscles collectively called the rotator cuff. When you press horizontally, as in a bench press, the head of the humerus is driven forward into the anterior capsule of the joint, repeatedly, with load. The anterior capsule stretches over time. The shoulder internally rotates. The posterior rotator cuff, infraspinatus, teres minor, which should be the joint's primary stabilizer, stops being trained and starts being compressed. The subacromial space narrows. Tissue that should glide begins to impinge. This is not a rare outcome. It is the predictable mechanical result of a training life dominated by horizontal pressing and its associated movement patterns. The clicking you feel at 43 is not age. It is structural drift, anterior capsule laxity combined with posterior capsule tightness, combined with a rotator cuff that has never been systematically loaded in the position where it does its actual job. The position where it does its actual job is overhead, in external rotation, under pulling load that requires it to eccentrically control a descending arc, which is exactly what 1,000 suburi does, every morning. The samurai did not know the words posterior capsule or subacromial space. They knew that a shoulder trained primarily in pulling, primarily overhead, and primarily through controlled deceleration did not develop the specific kind of impingement that ends a practitioner's ability to train. They built an entire practice architecture around that observation, and the joint held for 60 years. Samurai shoulders lasted not because warriors were harder. They lasted because the practice loaded what pressing leaves empty. That is the whole thing. What pressing leaves empty. The posterior cuff, the eccentric overhead arc, the deceleration pattern that is also the stabilization pattern. Modern fitness gave men the pressing half and called it shoulder training. The samurai practiced the half that keeps the joint intact. Why most people get this wrong. If you go looking for the samurai shoulder approach in a modern gym, you will find it misapplied in 3 specific ways. These are not minor errors. Each one eliminates the primary mechanical benefit of the practice. Failure mode 1. Training it heavy. The suburi repetition count was high, and the load was light by design. The posterior rotator cuff is not a power muscle. It is a precision muscle. It responds to sustained, controlled loading under high volume, not to low-rep heavy loading. When men apply progressive overload logic to overhead pulling movements, they shift the load away from the rotator cuff stabilizers and into the larger prime movers, the lats, the rear deltoid, which is useful for other goals but does nothing for joint longevity. The structural benefit requires light load, full range, controlled deceleration. Failure mode 2. Stopping overhead. Most overhead pulling exercises in modern programming stop at 90 degrees of shoulder elevation. The pull down, the cable row, the standard lat pull down. The critical rotator cuff loading in the suburi arc happens above 90 degrees, in the final third of the overhead range, when the infraspinatus and teres minor are maximally lengthened under tension. Stopping at 90 is like doing a half squat and expecting hip development. You are working around the position that produces the adaptation. Failure mode 3. Pressing first. The sequence matters. In a training session that begins with bench press, which internally rotates the shoulder and drives the humeral head forward, the posterior capsule is already under passive stretch before any corrective pulling work begins. The rotator cuff stabilizers are starting from a compromised position. Traditional samurai practice had no pressing work preceding the overhead pulling arc. The joint arrived at the practice fresh, not preloaded in the wrong direction. If you press before you pull overhead, you are practicing the wrong sequencing and accumulating the cost in tissue that cannot self-report the damage until it is significant. The complete protocol. This is how to replicate the mechanical benefit of suburi in a modern training context, not as a warm-up. As primary shoulder training. 3 sessions per week, every week, until the clicking is gone and the joint has relearned what stability feels like. The movement. Overhead band pull apart with eccentric deceleration. You need a light resistance band, lighter than feels necessary. If you are selecting the band, go 1 level below your instinct. The load is not the variable. The range and the control are the variables. Starting position. Stand with both arms extended overhead, band held with a grip slightly wider than shoulder width, palms facing forward. This is the top of the arc. The movement. Pull the band apart and down in a controlled arc until your arms are at your sides, elbows soft. Hold for 2 seconds at the bottom. Return to overhead in 3 seconds, against the band resistance, using a path that mirrors the descent. The return is not rest. The return is eccentric loading of the infraspinatus. It is the half of the movement most people skip. Repetitions. 30 repetitions per set. Not 10, not 15, 30. The rotator cuff responds to volume, not intensity. This is the non-negotiable variable. Sets. 4 sets. Rest 90 seconds between sets. Sequence. This movement is performed first in every session that includes it. Not after pressing, not as a finisher, first. Frequency. 3 sessions per week, minimum. 6 weeks before assessing. Week 2. If the movement feels easy at 30 repetitions, do not increase the band resistance. Add a third eccentric second to the return, 4 seconds up instead of 3. The time under tension is the progression variable, not the load. Week 4. If the posterior shoulder is loading correctly, you will feel a specific fatigue in the back of the shoulder joint. Not the rear deltoid, not the upper back, but the joint itself. A warm, full, deep engagement. That is the infraspinatus working the way it is designed to work. That feeling is the adaptation signal. Week 6. Reassess the clicking. Assess the internal rotation range. Most men with pre-existing anterior capsule drift will begin to notice a change in resting shoulder posture. The shoulder sits differently, slightly further back. The head of the humerus is beginning to center in the socket the way it is supposed to. The relationship to pressing. This protocol does not require you to eliminate bench pressing. It requires you to perform it after this movement, not before, and to match or exceed the volume of pulling to pressing in every session. The samurai shoulder was built on a pulling foundation. The pressing culture built its shoulder on a pressing foundation. The results are available to observe in every gym where men over 40 are training through pain they have decided is normal. It is not normal. It is mechanical drift with a specific correction. The correction is older than the problem. 60 years of sword practice, 1,000 repetitions before sunrise. A joint that did not degrade because the practice that built it also maintained it, by loading the exact tissue that modern training leaves empty, in the exact range that modern training stops short of, in the exact sequence that modern training gets backwards. The samurai shoulder did not survive 6 decades because warriors were exceptional. It survived because the practice was complete. Pressing builds the front. Pulling builds the joint. They built the joint.